Arthur looked up from the work on his desk. Through the windows he could see across the gatehouse, and he liked that some of the trees were starting to turn bright with fall colors. Today would mark the beginning of a new level in the war, and all the preparations his father and grandfather had made were now coming to fruition. He gathered up the remaining papers and put them in the shredder. Then he looked at his bed one more time, examining the two bags there, thinking carefully for just one more time whether everything was ready. As he did this, the fax on his desk rang, and anticipating the message, he knew the rest were now ready. This would be the confirmation. He was blissful. This had been a good life. It had certain values, but it also had certain problems. The merchant princes were now mostly mad and sane. They were no longer truly educated. They had little sense of history or of the role that wealth would really play in society, of the obligations that went with privilege. The world was going to convulse, and the people did nothing to stop this coming. They just tried to make sure of their own survival. Somebody had to do something. Arthur recalled his graduation from university and his father's pride that Arthur was willing to follow in his footsteps in spite of the opportunity to do other things. They had gone on a very long walk that day, talking about deep things few people would have understood or appreciated. None of his peers understood why Arthur was going back to the rich man's house to follow his father into the service of an old venerable banking family, instead of striking out on his own. Arthur knew they would not understand, so he had not tried. He could live with their disappointments and criticisms because he thought he knew where the world was headed and what the costs would be. Like his father and grandfather, Arthur styled himself incorrectly but not grossly so, a modern Knight Templar, a warrior for Christ. The Templars had been destroyed, but not all their values and ideas had died with them. Where the Templars had had a public existence, where what Arthur was becoming was something secret. Few were to know, and perhaps there would in the end be no knowledge of them historically. But as the old hereditary aristocracies went into decline and the merchant princes rose to power, something came to be alongside this change, something new among that group who made of their lives the service of the rich. Butlers, housemen, maids, whatever the names, just as wealth passed from generation to generation, so did service. Yet a few generations back, someone in the line of service added something new. Among just a few houses and families of service, a certain way of thinking came to be, a way of thinking which could see how the merchant princes were repeating, in the worst ways, the mistakes of their predecessors, the old aristocracies of blood. The question then came, what to do about the crisis that could be seen coming. So it came to pass that more and more certain sons and daughters were educated and then brought back into service. Relationships among families in service were cultivated. Marriages encouraged, alliances created. It was a work of generations, but a work with a purpose. At this moment of crisis, action could be taken. Action which might produce results quite beyond imagination. Now the time, the cusp had come, and Arthur was ready as were the others. Over the next few days, as the wealthy gathered among themselves to respond to the deepening crisis, certain individuals would come forward and act, and power and wealth would move from the hands of the merchant princes into the hands of their servants. No one would notice. No public outcry could arise. On the surface, things would remain the same, although a few would have to die. But the result would be delicious. The wealthy would retain the appearance of privilege and power, but it would be the former servants calling the shots behind the scenes. What Arthur did not know, what he couldn't know, was that even with all the foresight that had been applied, matters could not go the way his family had hoped. Crisis and chaos would rule, had to rule for a time. One civilization was dying and another would take its place, but no one would be able to ride the crest of the wave and come out on top. Arthur was just another individual struggling in a sea of change. Only after the crisis was past would it be possible to organize new forms of order. All Arthur and his friends were doing was participating in the creation of more disorder. They may have thought they could surf this way, but that was not to be, especially if one was hoping to ride it out at the top. The only safe place was at the bottom, holding hands with others, waiting it out, cooperating in survival, trying to dominate, to win. That was the path through destruction. Estes waited in the large drawing room while Arthur met the guests at the door, took care of the coats, and ushered them in one by one. Each one he greeted, while another servant, coached by Arthur's patient and impeccable style, mixed each one with their favorite beverage and brought it to them. They all made a bit of small talk. The ones who had never been to the retreat before admired the view from the drawing room, which overlooked the glass-enclosed pool. Estes would point to the grandchildren at play there, identifying one or another as to age and lineage and school. Some of the parents, some of his children, could also be seen near the bar at one end of the pool complex. For a moment his heart stalled as the thought of a certain once favorite child slipped into his mind unbidden. He refused to indulge himself and to engage in self-recrimination for having disinherited him. He turned his mind to other matters. Everyone was now present and had a few moments to get it comfortable, to enjoy a drink or tea as was their preference. Estes nodded to Arthur, who stood by the door, indicating that Arthur should leave and close the door behind him. Arthur gave a small nod in return, a slight bow, and closed the doors, but he did not leave. It took a moment for this to register on Estes' face and the others. Noting his surprise, turned toward the door as well, looking at the servant, who seemed to have something unusual in his mind. Arthur stepped quietly forward a few paces and spoke at that same gentle yet precise manner that was his usual form of address.
Gentlemen, if you don't mind taking a seat, there's something important you should all know. Master Estes, you too, if you don't mind. Will only take a moment. Now Estes was so nonplussed that he did as asked. His mind could not take hold of this unusual behavior, as unexpected as it was. When they were all seated, some feigning a relaxed manner that none of them truly felt, Arthur began to speak again. If you don't mind a bit of history, it will make things easier. Centuries ago, in the Middle East, a cult of assassins lived, who, having taken years in its development and organizing, managed to have members placed as servants in every royal household. Any ruler could be killed at will, usually with poison or blade. Estes, amongst the guests' surprise, feeling a deep rage, and started to walk towards Arthur, wanting to kill this man whose foolishness was ruining his meeting before it had even begun. He stopped, however, when Arthur removed a small silenced handgun from underneath his suit coat and behind his back. Gunfire could be heard from in front of the house. These men were all conscious of each other, and the panic calls had made for its own kind of chaos. Oh!
Arthur stood silently, watching each man carefully. In a moment, the outside gunfire died down, and shortly after, 3 small taps
sounded against the doors. Clearly some kind of signal to Arthur. "Please, gentlemen, be seated. You are wasting your time and perhaps your very lives. If you would be so kind as to quiet down, I haven't finished explaining reality to you yet." These men were not used to taking orders. They were order givers, and one of them pushed forward towards Arthur, saying that he, Arthur, would pay for this with his life. When Arthur calmly shot the man in the thigh, it became instantly much quieter. At Arthur's instruction, a tie was turned into a tourniquet, or perhaps better said, a pressure bandage. The shot had been well placed and was only a wound. Arthur continued to be impeccable. "I wish I could say more that there was such a modern organization, but there isn't. There are a few of us, yes, but our means are small, as are our numbers. You have been poisoned, but if you will listen carefully, you will not die, nor will your children and grandchildren." A collective gasp came out. What the? Arthur had all the cards. Arthur looked carefully at each of the now very frightened men. He had no sympathy for them. They were used to being order givers. They could order a death and probably had it without a second thought. They thought nothing of using violence if they could get away with it, and it served their purposes. Now the shoe was on the other foot. They knew now that their private gardens had come to harbor very deadly snakes. Now was the time to close the door and let them see who the real order givers would be. "I am no altruist. I am someone basically more dangerous, more terrible in purpose than any of you ever have been. I will have power you have yet to dream of." He paused to let that idea sink in. They were all fools, all of them, easily manipulated by someone stronger and more intelligent. They had come to their powers, most of them, by good fortune and family ties, not by raw effort. They were ruthless in maintaining their status, but they did not yet think far enough ahead. The plan Arthur was carrying out was a work of generations, a work patient beyond imagination, waiting for a particular moment of crisis. And then this work would steal the power from the order givers, and something new would emerge from the chaos. He could see by their faces, even the Asians who prided themselves on their ability to conceal emotion, that they were ready for the final shock. He called over his shoulder to the door. "Bring in the box." The door opened, and the servant who had mixed the drinks walked in, carrying in two hands a tray on which was a large box, covered by a black opaque cloth. At a gesture from Arthur, the man set the tray down on the coffee table in front of Estes and then stood nearby. "Well, my former master, did you not summon someone, a certain Charlie Corliss? Do you not even now perhaps harbor a secret hope that he will appear and rescue you from this stupidity of yours? I am sorry to say that he is not going to be any help to you at all, but if you wish, you may tell him of their disappointment." With these words, Arthur's companion reached out and suddenly pulled back the cloth, revealing a bloody, severed head. Estes recognized the remains of Charlie instantly and screamed and collapsed to the floor, twitching and spasming as if his heart had suddenly and viciously failed him.